Hello, everybody, and wherever you are, whatever time it is with you, welcome to the Sebald Lecture 2020. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, which forms part of the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. BCLT was founded by the acclaimed writer and critic W.G. Max Sebald in 1989. And this annual event, initially the St. Jerome Lecture, was renamed in his honour after his untimely death in 2001. BCLT is now a research centre within the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at UEA, and we've been celebrating our 30th anniversary over the past academic year. But of course, a few months ago, it turned into a very strange year indeed. At the onset of the coronavirus lockdown in mid-March, we had to close our physical premises along with the rest of the university, and we've all been working from home since then, unable to hold any events in person. I hope you've stayed well over the intervening time. As with so many other cultural organisations, we've taken the view that as soon as feasible, in whatever form viable, the show must go on. So, with the invaluable assistance of our regular partners, the British Library, we're delighted to be able to bring you the Sebald Lecture today. As ever, we're hugely grateful to the BL for their expertise, and in this case, digital hospitality. The Sebald Lecture is sponsored by Arts Council England through our continuing core partnership with the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. And thanks to their sponsorship, we're able to bring the lecture to you this year free of charge. The great advantage of this online format, the silver lining to the COVID-19 cloud, if you will, is that this year we're able to involve many more people than usual. And I'm reliably informed that there are over 1,000 in our live audience. I'm sure that has to do with the accessible format, but I'm equally sure that it also has to do with the eminence of today's speaker. For the Sebald Lecture each year, we invite a prominent cultural figure to speak about literary translation from their personal perspective. This afternoon, it's my great pleasure and honour to introduce to you this year's Sebald lecturer, David Bellos. David Bellos is Meredith Howland Pine Professor of French Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton University. He did his undergraduate and postgraduate studies in Oxford, gaining a DPhil on Balzac criticism in France in 1971, when a fellow by examination at Magdalen College. He taught subsequently at the universities of Edinburgh, Southampton, and Manchester, before moving to Princeton in 1997, where for 12 years he ran the programme in Translation and Intercultural Communication. He followed up his doctoral work with 3 scholarly monographs on Balzac, before turning to more modern literary writers in the late 1980s and beginning an equally distinguished career as a translator of fiction. In quick succession, he translated Life, a User's Manual, and 3 other books by Georges Perec, then published the first complete biography of Perec, Georges Perec, A Life in Words, which was translated into French and won the Prix Goncourt de la biographie in 1994. The following year, he was invited by Christopher MacLehose to translate the Albanian writer Ismail Kadare from French into English. And 4 novels later, when Kadare was awarded the inaugural Man Booker International Prize in 2005, Professor Bellos won the Associated Translators Award. By now, he's published no fewer than 29 book-length translations, and in 2011, an acclaimed introduction to translation issues, Is That a Fish in Your Ear? Translation and the Meaning of Everything. In addition to his biography of Perec, he's published 2 other literary biographies of Jacques Tati and Romain Gary. His most recent book is a study of Victor Hugo's masterpiece, the novel of the century, The Extraordinary Adventure of Les Misérables, published in 2017. In a moment, I'll hand over to Professor Bellos, who will deliver his lecture from Princeton, New Jersey. After the lecture, in an hour's time, he's kindly agreed to take questions from our live audience. Now, we'll try to take as many questions as possible, but given the size of our audience, I hope you'll appreciate that we will have to be very selective. If you would like to put a question to our speaker, then I invite you to use the Q&A function in Zoom, which will be live throughout the lecture. For now, though, let me hand over to David Bellos to give the Sebald Lecture 2020, which he has given the deliciously tantalizing title, The Myths and Mysteries of Literary Translation.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. It is an honor and a daunting honor for me to talk to you today about literary translation in the wake of a whole series of distinguished poets, novelists, and translators. I'm an academic and only a translator on the side, so to speak. So please forgive me for sticking to form and providing you, together with my thoughts on translation, a number of really nerdish facts. It's even more daunting for me to speak in a series of lectures named in honor and in memory of Max Sebald. It was my great privilege to meet Max on several occasions. I attended his seminar on the shadow of the Shoah at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And there we spoke at length about Georges Perec's strange fictional memoir, W, or the Memory of Childhood. And Max's main objection to it was that Perec had omitted from that wonderful work the pictures, the photographs, which he discusses at length within it. Max also graciously came and gave a talk to my class at the University of Manchester. And what I remember from that splendid occasion, most of all, most vividly, was that once Max had left the room, the student of mine said, "Well, that was Father Christmas without the beard." Max was an academic too, of course, but it was in his literary work that he grappled most intricately with many aspects of a problem, an issue that I'm going to be talking about today. And that's the difficulty that we have in communicating with others and in understanding how they communicate with us. Translation, of course, is a form of communication, a mode or a channel of communication. And it is beset with many mysteries. If I may speak very broadly, I mean, where there are mysteries that matter to us, there are also myths. Myths can serve to mitigate the terror we feel at the void of unknowing. But in the case of translation, I think they also do something else. Translation myths stop us from thinking. And though I don't believe I can tell you what translation is or how it is done or how it should be done best, I hope to be able to help you to think about translation. To do so, I'm going to pinpoint three frequently mentioned, long-standing themes or stories in the conversation we've been having about translation for the last 200 years. And I'd like to persuade you that these stories are not really helpful, and that's why I call them myths. Many distinguished translators have declared that the main demand their work makes on them is to bend and extend and enrich the language in which they write. It's not that French is difficult, I've heard my colleagues say. What's hard is learning how to handle English so as to say the same thing. And I must have said that myself many times. And of course it's true, up to a point. But precisely because it is partly true, it is also a myth that obscures other truths that may be more important. It's obvious that translators are almost always judged by their readers to be good, bad, or indifferent in terms of their writing skills in the receiving language. Few readers, and there are no doubt even fewer amongst those who get to share their judgments with the public, have the equipment to judge translators in any other way. Now, it's true, of course, that Keats did once congratulate a translator for having mastered the syntax of classical Greek with the persistence and valor of stout Cortés as he finally conquered a peak in Darien. But this famous encomium of Chapman's translation of Homer, of his grasp of the source, sticks in our memory precisely because felicitations of that kind are exceedingly rare. Translators and their critics, amongst whom I include practitioners of what's called translation studies, highlight and promote the role of target language skills in literary translation, not only because it's plain obvious that failure to master the resources of the target language would be horrible, but also, more egregiously, out of what psychologists would call confirmation bias. That's to say, translators can only engage in conversation with the community of readers of their translation on the basis of that translation. That's to say, in terms of the qualities of the target text within the context of the target language and culture. So there's no wonder that conversations about translation have almost always foregrounded the target language skills of the literary translator. But it has a pernicious effect. The pernicious effect of this story about translation is that it downplays, it downgrades, it obscures and puts in the shade the role of knowledge. Indeed, it's given rise, I think, to what I would call the myth of ignorance. That consists of the outrageous claim made by many otherwise quite sensible people that you don't need to know the source language particularly well in order to translate it with flair, even brilliance. What are dictionaries for, I hear people say. In any case, when you come to a particularly thorny passage, you can ask someone else, a native speaker, to help you out. The meaning of the original isn't really a mystery. We can work it out. We have lots of tools. It's saying it properly in English or in whatever target language you're working into that is the thing that calls for skill and, dare we say it, genius. Now, I think that position is rubbish. I'll say it again. C'est de la poudre aux yeux. However, my self-serving opponents insist. They point to Marcel Proust, who translated Ruskin so brilliantly into French without knowing much English. Proust, after all, it's Marcel Proust, he can do no wrong. Or else they point to Jean Giono, the translator of Moby Dick into French. Now, he hardly knew any English at all. On a less beaten track, we find learned studies of the genius of Georges Perec, and he was a genius, I guarantee you that, as displayed in his translations of two novels by his friend, the American Harry Matthews, which Perec clearly did not understand very much at all. How did he manage? This is how. He wrote a letter, 4th of January 1971. Dear Harry, I've managed to carry on with Cluse on my own. And I've got, without too much trouble, to the soirée at the Palazzo Zen, and then I ran into a leg-over episode and lost the thread entirely. But I think we'll be able to get on fairly fast when we work together again. Actually, Marcel Proust managed in much the same way. I mean, he didn't know enough English to write to Ruskin anyway, and Ruskin had died before Proust had made much progress with translating the Bible of Amiens. So he didn't turn to the author, he turned to his mother and asked her to tell him what the sentences meant. Actually, it's now widely accepted that Marcel Proust did not actually translate Ruskin, just as Perec did not really translate Harry Matthews. The translator of Proust's Bible d'Amiens was Jeanne Weil, that's to say, the writer's mother. And the translator of Giono's Moby Dick was Joan Smith, who did what's called a literal, and then got her friend Lucien Jacques to make sense of it in French, allowing Jean Giono to polish it up to his own taste, and he did so very well. Now, there's nothing wrong in asking for help. No reason not to accept it, especially when, like Giono, you've paid somebody for the task. Only a very vain and blinkered translator would studiously avoid seeking help solely in order to proclaim at the end that the translation was all her own work. That's not a very sensible procedure either. But it is equally obvious that it is far more efficient to translate what you understand and to leave other people to do the rest. Knowing what it means is the first and most fundamental requirement for translation even to exist. Being a Proust or a Giono really won't stand in lieu. It really won't. However, as night follows day, knowing what it means goes far beyond grasping vocabulary, syntax, and style, though I grant that that's a pretty good start. To know what something means, you need to know what it's about. Now, that's not a faux naif translation of academic abstractions like possession of cultural competence. I mean it literally. You need to know what it's about in order to know what it means. When working from the simplest report card to the grandest literary edifice, it is eminently desirable for the translator to know not only what the sentences say, but to know what the sentences are dealing with. There's nothing grander, of course, than Victor Hugo's Les Misérables. And the example that I want to take from it is really very simple, almost banal. What the characters are talking about when they talk about money. Hugo's doorstopper deals with the plight of the poor in 19th century France. Another part of the plot deals with a substantial fortune amassed by an ex-convict under a different name. And as a result, money crops up quite a lot in Les Misérables. It's one of the things that the novel really does deal with. On the other hand, it is not at all obvious what the money expressions in that novel actually refer to. Hugo could have put all those money expressions in figures, but he did not. He lays them out in the now almost impenetrably muddy language of money of 19th century France. So to know what is being talked about, you have to learn, how should we say, to count like Monsieur Madeleine. You have to acquire competence in the things that those expressions refer to in order to understand what actually is going on. So this is the nerdish part of my talk, and I hope it will turn out to be of some use to you as readers of 19th century novels in general. That's because in the 19th century in France, there was not one, but at least three different ways of talking about money. There were three different sets of vocabulary for the same things. Only the official way is still more or less familiar to us because it expired only in the first year of this century, and it's also structurally similar to the way in which we count money in the modern world too. The unit of currency from 1803 was the French franc. It was divided into 100 centimes, and that is all perfectly straightforward. What's actually forgotten is that the franc was fixed for over 100 years as 5 grams of coin silver. And that wasn't notional. The 1 franc coin was actually made of 5 grams of coin silver. However, in Hugo's day, I mean, during his lifetime and also in the period in which Les Misérables is set, francs, I mean, money was denominated, expressed verbally as so many francs, really only for official transactions, paying taxes, paying fines, getting your money from a prison payout or your pay as a soldier and so forth. It was the right way to do sums. It was the official legal way to do sums. But in actual speech between people, it had very limited application. For that reason, when people in the novel do talk in francs, they do not mean exactly what you think they mean, because they also mean, I'm talking in the language of the state. The second way of talking about money was the way poor people talked about it. They did not talk in francs. They talked exclusively in sous. Now, it's actually quite a sophisticated thing to do, because there were no sous coins, no coins marked as sous, and there were no coins having the value of a sous either. So we're dealing here with notional units. They were computed as 1/20th of a franc. So when a mountain lad called Petit Gervais in the earlier parts of Les Misérables loses a coin to the still unreformed ex-convict Jean Valjean, he asks for it back. He says, "Give me back my 40 sous coin." But obviously what was marked on the coin was not 40 sous. There were no coins denominated in sous. It said 2 francs. Yeah? That's 40 times 5 equals 200. Petit Gervais' use of the expression 40 sous, 40 sous, therefore marks him as a member of the underclass. And that meaning is intrinsic to the expression that he used. Incidentally, his use of the term also is an indication of the fact that everybody, literate or not, in 19th century France could multiply and divide by 5 and 20 in their heads, which I'm not sure everybody can now. Anyway, the third language of money in 19th century France was used not by the poor, not by the state, but by the well-off, people who had plenty of it. For them, the unit of currency was called the livre in the feminine. A livre was exactly equivalent to a franc, but they would use the word livre in preference to franc to talk about income from investments, from rents, from land, fees, stipends, and so forth. So you could say, well, it doesn't matter, it's the same thing as franc, so why not just say franc? Well, the reason not to say franc is that the use of the word livre means something else. It means that the speaker is in the world of the moneyed classes. So this third language of money, as you might expect, was by far the most elaborate in its range of vocabulary. For decades, the largest silver coin minted was the 5 franc coin, and it showed the king's head. So people who called a franc a livre called the 5 franc coin a louis, but not always. Sometimes they called it an écu. So 5 francs, louis, écu, same thing. But using that word écu was particularly confusing because there were pre-revolutionary, pre-1789 écus. They weren't legal tender officially, but they were in circulation because of the metallic value. And they were sometimes worth 3 and sometimes worth 6 francs or livres. And do read Eugénie Grandet by Balzac to discover how you can manipulate that. So I hope you're beginning to see that it is not actually straightforward at all to know what the characters of Les Misérables are talking about when they talk about money. Now, for the common folk, for whom that 5-franc coin was the largest financial item they were ever likely to have in their hands, it was just a 100 sou coin, une pièce de 100 sous. Or they called it a monarch, because it got the king's head on it. Or they called it a luisant, a shiner, because it was made of silver. And they called it many other things besides that. So that's for the silver coinage, which consisted of quarter-franc, half-franc, franc, 2-franc, and 5-franc coins. Now for the gold. Gold was the backbone of the system, and it was fixed at a parity at 15.5 to silver. The principal, almost exclusive gold coin was the 20-franc piece. Let's say 20 livres. And as you know, it's also 4 louis or 4 écus, depending on how you spoke about it. And it therefore weighed 6 and a bit grams. It was the cornerstone of the monetary system introduced by Napoleon in 1803, and it bore Napoleon's profile on the head side, and so it was called a Napoleon, just as a louis was called a louis. Less expectedly, the Napoleon went on being called a Napoleon even after 1815, when Napoleon himself, as you know, took a trip to St. Helena, and Louis XVIII, the Bourbon king, was restored to the throne of France, and minted new coins with his head on them of exactly the same gold weight as the Napoleon. Some old monarchists and some new monarchists as well found it rather difficult to call a coin bearing the king's head a Napoleon. So they called it a louis. But as I hope you've remembered from 2 minutes ago, that name was already taken by a coin worth 1/4 of that. It didn't matter in daily life. I mean, you can see and feel the difference between 25 grams of silver and 6 and a bit grams of gold. But in a novel, do you see? You have to know what the sentence is about before you can actually know what it means. There was a second gold coin minted in the 19th century that was also called a Napoleon. It was worth 40 francs, and obviously it was simply a Napoleon twice the size. It should have been called a double Napoleon, a double Napoleon, and it is called that now by coin collectors and numismatists, but it wasn't often called by users of it in the 19th century because, again, you can tell the difference between a small and a bigger gold coin. However, in a novel, when a desperate young man throws down his last Napoleon on the green baize of a gambling den, you, the reader, need to stop and think of what it is that he's about to lose. Knowledge of the referent, such as the information I've just given you, does not mean that you know how to translate Les Misérables. Of course not. And I'm not going to solve the issue as to how you would put any of that into English. The point I wish to make is simply that without the knowledge that I've given you, you are most unlikely to get it right, however brilliant your skills in English are. You cannot deduce from a text a code which that text does not explain, and it doesn't explain it because the author naturally took it for granted that his readers knew what he was talking about. One minor lesson that I would like to include in this talk is that actually what is not made explicit in a text is often what most needs to be understood by the translator. And for that, genius doesn't help a bit. You need to know what the work is about, as well as what the words in it mean. Now, Les Misérables is also the subject, not of a myth, but of a kind of a legend in the annals of translation history. And I'd like to tell you this story as well, because it comes halfway between myth and history. Now, the first volumes of Les Misérables appeared on April the 2nd, 1862 in Brussels first and in Paris. Just 8 months later, on December the 1st, 1862, the whole of part 1 of that huge novel appeared in New York in English translation under the title Fantine. Now, it took some time, of course, for books to get from Europe to America in those early days of steam. And of course, it took time to make fair copies, to set up in type and to print and to bind and so forth. So in the 8-month period, we can say that the translator, Charles Wilbur, had about 6 months to actually do the work. So do you realize, in the space of 6 months, Charles Wilbur polished off 150,000 words of some of the most elaborate and dramatic French prose ever written, and he didn't have a laptop. He didn't have a typewriter. He didn't even have any steel nibs. He spent his first hour of the morning sharpening quills, just like Victor Hugo had done for the original, before scratching away at what today I guess we would have to regard as unachievable, unbelievable speed. Of course, there's some things he didn't have to do that today's translators do. He didn't waste any time talking to an agent, and the agent didn't waste any time talking to the publisher to acquire English language rights, because the United States did not recognize copyright in works by non-citizens at that time. But even so, Wilbur's achievement is an exploit. It's a marvel, and it points to a mystery. The original American Fantine of 1862 is not a rough draft. It is not a botched job. It's the version that allowed Hugo's novel to become the highest-selling work of fiction ever published in the United States. It's the version that gave the story, the characters, the ideas of Les Misérables a preeminent place in 20th century American popular culture. Les Misérables has been quoted by innumerable judges and attorneys in court cases. It's been referenced in speeches by actually every American president since Woodrow Wilson, with some light corrections and rephrasings by Isabel Hapgood in the earlier part of the 20th century. The Wilbur translation has remained the primary access to Les Misérables for well over a century, and it is still in print in the USA. The title of the first book of part 1 of Les Misérables is, in French, injuste. That adjective now points to Monseigneur Myriel, the good bishop of Digne, whose charitable, extraordinarily charitable behavior turns the dark-souled ex-convict Jean Valjean into a seeker of goodness throughout the rest of the novel. Now, Myriel is indeed a just man, a righteous man. He's a fair, kind, and judicious man. These terms are all within the general range of meaning of the word injuste. Charles Wilbur chose to say an upright man. Later translators, Norman Denny, Julie Rose, Christine Donaher, have replaced that word with one of the many others that also fit more or less well. Why did they do that? I don't know, maybe just to be different. Because upright is fine as a translation. In fact, it's very good. It's pretty much what Victor Hugo meant it to say. So the mystery for me that arises from Charles Wilbur's extraordinary work and its post-history is this. A first rapidly done translation of a new work is not, in practice, necessarily less good than subsequent attempts to update and improve it. From this, I draw the provisional conclusion that there seems to be no proportional relationship between the time taken and the resources used in the process of translation and the product. Now, it's a mystery because I think that is obviously not true of most forms of human endeavor, from knitting socks to sending a man to the moon. There is a proportional relationship between the resources and time taken and the sturdiness of the result. So the oft-repeated mantra, I suppose, the oft-repeated cliche that translations need redoing every 30 or 50 or 70 years. And in fact, the figure seems to vary in function of the extension of copyright protection. That cliche, to me, doesn't express any demonstrable truth about translating. Seems to me that we should probably put it alongside the myth of the preeminence of target language skills as another case of confirmation bias, if not wishful thinking. It would hardly be contentious to assert that translators bring texts from foreign languages into some other tongue. On this apparently solid basis, translation studies, beginning with Schleiermacher's essay on the different methods of translating in 1813, has built a large edifice of thought and argument about the competing claims of the preservation and destruction of the foreign in a translated work. Now, in this context, foreign is a kind of catch-all term that may refer to all sorts of different things in linguistic, stylistic, cultural, historical, social, political, and so forth, or any set of these. But there is a problem with the very foundation of this argument. It seems to me that the whole edifice has been built on what now look like to be like shifting sands. Let me explain. In the United States, many universities have a foreign language requirement, either for admission to their courses or for graduation with a degree. But in recent years, ASL, American Sign Language, has become a surprisingly popular option for students. And they have asked for their proficiency in signing, in sign language, to be treated as fulfilling that foreign language requirement. Initial institutional responses were negative, as they usually are, and they're based on the apparently very sensible idea that ASL, although it actually began in France in the 18th century, is not foreign to the United States. Students and alert academics then pointed out that in the same sense, Spanish is not foreign to the United States either. It was spoken in California and Texas, for example, long before English ever was. And then, of course, French has similarly been spoken in what used to be called Louisiana, the southern states, a lot longer than that. And what about Cherokee, Chinook, Algonquin? And you see the point. It really put the cat among the academic pigeons. The result is that my university and several others haven't dropped the foreign language requirement, but they've changed its name. It's now just called the language requirement, which means that students who do acquire proficiency in sign language fulfill that requirement. Foreign, it seems, is nowadays just not a very handy way or convenient way of labeling languages that happen not to be English. But this institutional sidestep, so to speak, is really just the tip of an intellectual and cultural iceberg that looms in front of an intellectual inheritance the size of a Titanic. It's that the formerly apparently solid boundaries between what is ours, as the Russians say, and what is not, are beginning to crumble. Between what the philologist Leo Spitzer called das eigene and das Fremde, the own and the other. It's taken a long time to sink, because the first hole in the hull of that vessel was made 100 years ago by Edward Sapir. He's the man whose name is attached to that also mythical construct called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, though it's somewhat misleading to call it that way. In his short but very brilliant book called Language, Edward Sapir demonstrated a century ago that there is and can be no correlation between language, culture, and ethnicity. Now, at that time, his main concern was to explain why there is no hierarchy between languages, no hierarchy of an intellectual kind. And it was a very anti-colonial and advanced position to adopt in those days, when it was still thought that primitive languages were spoken by primitive people. But the point he made has great and still not fully developed implications for the business of translation. For this reason, you might assume, we do assume, everybody assumes, that a Russian novel has to have been written in Russian, and that by being written in Russian, it manifests and conveys meanings and nuances that are intrinsic to the culture and history of the land called Russia and of the people who live there. But it's not really true. José Manuel Prieto's Nocturnal Butterflies of the Russian Empire is the English title of what is undoubtedly a Russian novel written in Spanish by a Cuban immigrant to the United States. And he spent much of his life in Novosibirsk, which is why the novel he wrote is really a Russian novel. In another direction of travel, André Maquine's A Hero's Daughter, the first of his novels to be published in French, is a French novel written by a Russian, but because it was purportedly translated from Russian, it was assumed to convey meanings intrinsic to the culture and ethnicity of his homeland. But it really doesn't do that because it was written in French. Antoine Volodine, for his part, explicitly seeks to write in French as if it were a foreign language. Now, by that striking expression, he means two different things, both of which I think are of great interest to us. First, he means to say that for him, French is not essentially the language that he uses to talk to the baker and the butcher and the candlestick maker in everyday life. French for him is the language in which he has read Melville and Dostoevsky and Marquez and Thomas Mann and so forth. French is his access to the rest of the world, and in that sense, it is for him the language of the foreign. In parallel, he wants to use French, or he believes he is using French, to write about things that have no necessary or essential connection to the customs, experience, habits, and ways of thinking of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and so forth in his hometown in France. He wants to write French as if it were coming from elsewhere, because for him, French is the language that brings things from elsewhere. Now, his project seems to me not at all mad, entirely feasible, but also significant for the understanding of literary translation. A language may, of course, quite intentionally or unconsciously be a vehicle for the expression of features that are local to its author and to its initial audience. But it doesn't have to be. There's no fatality that makes a novel in French a novel about France or a French novel. There's no steel divider between what is domestic and what is not. In any case, if we insist on thinking in terms of foreign and domestic, we have to grant that some native things are quite foreign to us already. The constructed language of Lord of the Rings, for example, which is made from scraps of languages spoken in the British Isles before English had been invented, are as domestic as you can get, and of course captivatingly foreign to the readers of Tolkien. In New York City today, at least 140 languages other than English are spoken, and many of them are written, by people who are already or are in process of becoming American citizens. And the linguistic situation of London, Paris, Berlin is surely much the same. Syriac, Fulani, Hungarian, Yiddish, German are as capable as English of expressing the culture of any great metropolis or suburb or homestead. And in that sense, they cannot be said to manifest or convey necessarily the cultures or ethnicities of the ancient Middle East, West Africa, Europe, whatever. Now, before you protest too loudly, let me remind you that we have long been accustomed to reading literary works in English that manifest and convey experiences, cultures, and ethnic identities far removed from our own. Just a few examples. David Mitchell's Thousand Sons of Jacob de Zoet tells us what it was like, or imagines what it was like, to be a Dutchman in Edo-era Japan. Hemingway gave us the mind of an old Cuban fisherman. Dickens winkled his way into the thoughts of a French aristocrat in revolutionary times. Shakespeare gave us a vision of the world as seen by a Moor in Venice. We cannot take seriously the capacity of our own language to venture abroad without granting other languages the capacity and the right to portray our own culture. And I urge you to read Princess Bari by Hwang Sok-yong, where London is presented through the eyes of an illegal immigrant from North Korea, and it's really quite surprising. Now, I don't mean to say all languages are the same, all languages can do exactly the same thing. That's not true. But I wish to repeat and to insist on the main point made by that great linguist Edward Sapir 100 years ago. All languages, insofar as they are human languages, are capable of expressing the culture of any people. And second, that no language has a fixed link to ethnicity, whatever that is. Translators should therefore think twice before repeating long-established myths about what they do in the world, what their function is. Foreignness is not a given. Indeed, it's not a real thing at all. Consequently, the spate of writing about the conflict between foreignizing and domesticating, between preservation and destruction of the foreign, well, much of it academic writing, I should add. I mean, it's not just a lot of hot air, but it does need to be refounded on more solid ground. I think the myth of the foreign is something we have to learn to do without. My third main topic today is what I'll call the myth of the translator. Now, obviously, translations are the work of translators. In conversations about translation, at least in the field of literature, it's often taken for granted that each translation is the work of a translator. Of course, we're all aware that translators are in conversation with their editors and copy editors, sometimes with their authors, in the case of contemporary works, and very often with trusted colleagues, and even with informants on specialized topics, such as younger and older adults in their family's circle to check up on current terminology or the names of obsolete domestic equipment. Even so, the idea that a translation is fundamentally the expression of an author, mediated by a translator, is the baseline for almost all essays about the task of the translator, including the most famous one that I don't even claim to understand. Again, I want to treat this commonsensical, ordinary language approach, which is enshrined in copyright legislation, in liability clauses, and long-standing practices of cultural kind, as a convenient, but to some extent misleading myth. And for that, we need to go back to the beginning. In around the year 240 BCE, so the story goes, Ptolemy II, the Macedonian pharaoh of Egypt, sent scouts to Judea to round up a cohort of scholars to bring them back to Alexandria to do a rush job for him. Whether they were paid like today's translators or whether they were enslaved like today's translators is not known. Ptolemy booked them into an island resort at Pharos, the island where there was the great lighthouse, and told them to get on with producing a version in Greek of the Holy Book of the Jews, who constituted a significant, though we don't really know how large, but anyway, a minority within the population of his capital city, Alexandria, at that time. According to a story, a myth, a legend, that arose probably in Babylon about 1,000 years later, there were 70 or 72 Judean translators involved in this project. It was completed in a short time, with the team in unanimous agreement about all the words chosen. Now, such agreement is highly unlikely in any team of translators, as I'm sure some of you know. It's even less likely among a team of Jewish scholars. And for that reason, an additional legend arose, namely that the target text was in fact dictated to them all from on high. Now, this story is not just an amusing piece of myth-making in the ancient world. The Greek version of the Torah, of the Hebrew part of the Bible, that we now know as the Septuagint, using the Latin, not the Greek word for 70, is the first written translation in the entire Western tradition, the earliest by far of all written translations that have survived. We do not know very much about the Judean, in fact, we know nothing about the Judean scholars themselves, except this. They'd been asked to do something that had not yet been invented. They had no precedent to work with. They had no conventions, no customs, no general understanding of what a translation was. They had no grammar of biblical Hebrew and no schoolbook grammar of Greek either. So we do owe them a lot. They invented a new craft, our craft. Amazingly, within a very short space of time, probably about 10 years, the idea of translation was picked up in Rome, where the first translations from Greek into Latin were commissioned. And that gave rise over the years to a whole new thing called Latin literature. Almost 2,000 years later, King James of Scotland and England tried the same approach. In 1604, he charged the president of Corpus Christi College in Oxford, John Reynolds, to produce a translation of the Book of Prophets as a trial run. Reynolds did not do it on his own. He worked with a committee, and then 5 other committees were established elsewhere in Cambridge and other Oxford colleges to render all the other books of the Bible. As a current Wikipedia entry puts it, I quote, "These scholars examined every word to determine the most felicitous turns of phrase before sending their work to colleagues for confirmation." These committees worked for only 7 years, actually, which is really not very long. And the collective translation, now known as the King James Version, or the Authorized Version, appeared in 1611. Now, the impact of the Septuagint and the King James Version, the KJV, can hardly be overstated. The first enabled Christianity to spread around the Mediterranean 700 years later, since Greek was the common language of many communities in that area. And the second, the KJV, brought a degree of peace, or at least a truce, to religious conflict in England. And of course, as we all know, it marked the English language very profoundly. My point is that neither of these absolutely foundational works was translated by a translator. Both of them are collective works. They arose from the efforts of a group of people in multilateral dialogue with each other. Given the importance of these two events in the history of translation, and not to mention the more or less collective origins of more recent works of importance, such as, Proust Ruskin, Jonas Melville, or Gombrowicz, or Joyce, or Freud in French, we should stop basing practically all our discussions of literary translation on the assumption of sole authorship. Literature, as said the French poet Lautréamont, is made not by one, but by many. Translation 2. However, and here I want to tell my second story that is not mythical, but legendary. There are some remarkable individuals in the annals of translation who did more than can easily be figured and did it entirely on their own. Tatyana Gnidich is perhaps the greatest solitary heroine in our whole field. In 1948, a scholar called Efim Etkind was asked to go to apartment number 24 at number 73 Kirov Prospect in Leningrad to meet Mikhail Lozinsky, who was a distinguished poet, one of the leading Russian translators of his age. "I've just received a manuscript from Tatyana Gnidich," Lozinsky told Etkind, "from the Bolshoi Dom." Now, Bolshoi Dom means the big house. It was the code word for the offices of the security apparatus, the NKVD. Extraordinary to get a translation from the secret police. "It's a translation," Lozinsky went on, "it's Byron's Don Juan in classical 8-line rhyming stanzas. The whole of it. 17,000 lines. And the NKVD want my opinion." So who was Tatyana Gnidich? She was the descendant of a noble Russian family, an intellectual, a student, fascinated by 17th century English literature, and she'd remained very much in the world of letters and the world of literature through those terrible years of the 1930s. She stayed in Leningrad during the siege from 1941 to 44. But when the siege was over and people came back, Tatyana Gnidich was nowhere to be found. Now, of course, many people had disappeared in those terrible years from starvation, war, exile, disease. But actually, Tatyana Gnidich had survived. Like millions of others in Stalin's Russia, she was just in a gulag. Years after hearing Lozinsky read out a few of the stanzas of that mysterious manuscript from state security police, Etkind heard a knock at his own door. And there she stood, Tatyana Gnidich in person. She moved in as she had nowhere else to go. And she spent the next months typing out her verse translation of Don Juan from the sole carbon copy she'd been allowed to keep. It smelled dreadful. It had been in the gulag with her. It turned out that just before the end of the war, Tatyana Gnidich had been sentenced to 10 years in a prison camp. But before being sent off to the north, she was held in a city prison in Leningrad. A kindly interrogator asked her why she hadn't borrowed any books from the prison library as she was entitled to do. "I'm busy. I haven't got any time," she replied. "Busy with what?" "I'm translating. Byron." "So, did she have the text?" "No, I'm doing it from memory," she replied. The officer was astounded by the claims of this obviously rather eccentric lady in his charge. So he got her a piece of paper and asked her to write down all she had done so far. She didn't dare ask for a second sheet of paper. The next day, the interrogator came back to the cell to read what she'd written down. But he would have needed a microscope. Tatyana had written in letters barely larger than pinheads. Each stanza took up no more than half a square centimeter of paper, and that's what allowed her to write out the whole of Canto 9 of Byron's Don Juan, or the two sides, a single piece of Russian paper. The officer was obviously amazed. He was so amazed that he did something quite nice. He put Tatyana in a cell of her own, got her a copy of Byron's Don Juan from the prison library, got her a dictionary, got her a pencil, and adequate supplies of paper. And he let her get on with it. And it was understood that she would do just that before going to the Gulag. It took her 2 years. In that time, apparently, she took no exercise in the yard, read no other book, and did nothing but translate, morning, noon, and night, until that vast work was done. Then she gave it to the officer, who said she wouldn't leave her cell until it had been typed up by the prison secretary and sent for approval. So the top copy went into a safe. The first carbon copy was for her to keep. And the third was that one that was dispatched for review to the critic Glazinski, as we learned a few minutes ago, and that's how Etkind came to hear about it in 1948. So when those 3 copies had been typed up and corrected for typos, then it was time for Gnedich to begin her real sentence in a hard labor camp. She managed to hang on to the carbon copy throughout those years of toil and horror. And she carried on making corrections to it in her head, so that on her release, when she typed up the whole thing one more time in the apartment of Etkind, it became the final version. 18 months later, Tatyana Gnedich's Russian verse translation of Don Juan was published in Leningrad with a print run of 100,000 copies. 100,000 copies. The advance on royalties came to 17,000 rubles, no doubt more money than Madame Gnedich had seen in her entire life to date. Then that translation was adapted for the stage, and it ran for many years. Now you could say, it's not unreasonable to say, and I actually believe that Byron saved Gnedich's life, not only because her work on it attracted the protection of a benign prison officer, but essentially because it gave her a reason for not giving up on life, as so many inmates of that dreadful system did. But it's also quite reasonable to see in this legendary example of persistence in circumstances of extreme deprivation, a model demonstration of the fact that sometimes the greatest translations are done not by many, but just by one. How Gnedich turned Byron into Russian verse in 2 years. How Charles Wilber turned Les Misérables into an American Fantine in just 6 months. These are, shall we say, mysteries of a human kind. Let's not seek to explain them. Let's just marvel at them. However, the high valor of these legendary heroes of literary translation is not the central mystery of the trade of the tasks that we fulfill. Now, I've asked you to make an effort in your minds to step aside from 3 themes or topics that run through the conversation about translation. That is, first, to stop taking it for granted that great translators don't need to know the source language very well or to be deeply versed in the minutest details of the worlds that their source texts convey. Second, to stop using or relying on or appealing to that freighted, weighted, muddle-headed idea called the foreign as an explanation for the difference of the texts that we rewrite. And to abandon as a basis for the discussion of translation the idea that our work is always done by one and not by a whole community, whether formally constituted or not. Now, there are plenty of other myths that I wish and do treat with skepticism, the myth of literalism, for example, but I hope these 3 points will suffice to persuade you that translation studies, or the study of translation, is not yet a fully developed discipline in its own right. It's just beginning to emerge from its cocoon, made of a tangle of self-justifications and confirmation bias and wishful thinking. The objection to my plea is very simple. However, without these three myths, what is there to talk about when we talk about translation? Well, I don't have an answer. I cannot tell you what really happens when I sit down with a text in French and write it in English. I can't watch myself thinking, or not thinking actually, because the skill that translators have is precisely the ability to do it in the same way that we ride bicycles, let's say, without a thought for the physics of instability and the Coriolis force. Now, I don't know whether explanations for what it is that translators do will come from linguistics, or from neuroscience, from informatics, from cultural studies, or from common sense. But I do not think that the mystery of the translator's art is unique, or perhaps not even very special. For I do not know how it is that what I am saying right now will be processed in a microsecond inside your heads to produce the meaning that you've just grasped. Nor can I ever know the degree to which your reception matches what I believe to be the meaning of what I said. The mystery of translation is a sideshow. It's a vital sideshow, but it's a sideshow nonetheless in the overall mystery of how it is that people do or think they understand each other. In the last work that Max Sebald published before his tragic death in 2001, the eponymous hero, Jacques Austerlitz, describes a breakdown that he once suffered. It took the form of a loss of confidence in the very tools that we have to communicate with each other, including ourselves. And let me now quote that amazing, or part of that amazing passage. "The panic I felt on facing the start of any sentence that must be written, not knowing how I could begin it, or indeed any other sentence, soon extended to what is in itself the simpler business of reading. The entire structure of language, the syntactical arrangement of parts of speech, punctuation, conjunctions, and finally even the nouns denoting ordinary objects were all enveloped in impenetrable fog. The very thing which may usually convey a sense of purposeful intelligence, the exposition of an idea by means of a certain stylistic facility, now seemed to me nothing but an entirely arbitrary or deluded enterprise." That's from Austerlitz, page 123. Well, that was a breakdown, a disturbance, lamentable, just a step away from madness. It is that. But it is also something more important to us as translators, because obviously we are professionally inclined and indeed socially constructed to keep clear of the cliff edge over which Jacques Austerlitz nearly falls. However, we may not like to admit it, we certainly don't like to admit it, we are always actually within inches of that edge. I mean, try reading a page of Derrida and you see what I mean. But not only Derrida. At a certain distance, any page, though its style and syntax may be luminous and clear, is an impenetrable mystery. And I think we would do well to remind ourselves that no myth of translation is ever likely to pierce entirely the unfathomable puzzle of how it is that we make ourselves understood to others and to ourselves. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for a wonderfully rich and a wonderfully inspiring Sebald lecture. We've been getting a lot of responses and some great questions coming in. And so it's my job now really to channel those questions and to put them to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to take some questions and to say a little more about the topics that you've been covering in your lecture. I'd like to begin, I think, with a question that's come in from Subhashri Biman. And this is about the first topic that you were covering, relating to the use of helpers when the question of expertise. Subhashri Biman's question is this: if you want to translate a novel, say South Asian, which no one knows about, but the translator has limited knowledge of the source language, but is deeply touched by what they read, and decide to translate it, what measures can they take to not come across as a fake translator?
Oh, well, the circumstance, sorry, can you all hear me? Is that going, is the sound on? Oh, thank you. In circumstances such as those, I would encourage, both expect and encourage such a translator to work with an informant or informants in the source culture and to produce a halfway joint or collective translation. I think that would be very sensible. I do appreciate that problem. There are many things I didn't talk about today, one of which is the terrible asymmetry in translation relations between different languages and how difficult it is for works written in, how should we say, not commonly translated languages, which is all the languages of India to begin with, to actually get a hearing in those languages that traditionally occupy the bulk of the space of translation, and that's obviously English, French, and German. Yes, indeed, using informants and getting help from the community is the obvious, or is an obvious way to go. I'm not sure how else it could be done.
Thank you. A question of a similar kind from Marina Popea, who asks, do you see a recurring pattern in the gender of the helpers and that of those who signed the translations?
I know what you're getting at there. I don't know, actually. I haven't, it's, the history of literature is quite difficult to handle in terms of gender because of the use of pseudonyms, and of course we all know that many women used male names, but also the other way around. The history of translation and its current status is infinitely more murky than that. A great deal of number of translations, as you know, into every language have been published anonymously, without any attribution of a name, so we really don't know whether it's by men or women. Quite a lot of translator names are fictitious and of unknown gender. I think to actually answer that question would call for more knowledge than is actually available.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment actually I'd like to just report from Chris Durbin in Paris, who says, I love the way your focus on specialization, on mastering the subject matter in literary translation aligns with the priority we commercial translators give to it, as in not enough on its own, but without it, there's no way to move into the premium end of the market, says Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I think this this observation conforms quite well to my view that there is nothing special about literary translation as translation. What's special about it is the works that we deal with.
Thank you. I have now a question from Adriana Uribe, who asks, taking into consideration the thorough research required by a literary translator, is it fair to consider that someone who translates from their native language into a second language would be at a disadvantage? And there was a question from Rebecca DeWalt along similar lines.
Yeah. Well, that is what I call, you know, the L2 question. That is vast, lengthy, and very and to which the answers are very unclear. There have been times and cultures where L2 translation was preferred over L1 translation. In the Soviet Union, notably, they took the view that command of the source was more important than native fluency in the target. Only somebody who really knew the source language, context, history, and culture was capable of giving it full expression in any other language. It's difficult because you have to remember that, you know, vast tracts of European philosophy and literature were written in Latin, which was L2 for the authors. So that translations often are from an L2, so why shouldn't they be into an L2? And then thirdly, to repeat what I said in response to the first question about translations from not very often translated languages, such as Kannada or Hindi or Albanian or whatever, who is there to do the translating if not an L2 translator, given that these languages are not learned, at least very, very rarely learned, by speakers of one of the major circulating languages in the world. So this is a large issue, and I have no final view on it. I think it would be absurd, it would be to deny the truth of the history of translation, to say that L2 translation is bad or to be excoriated or to be banned. I mean, you know, the TLS says things like that, but who believes the TLS? I mean, you just couldn't have world literature without L2 translation over the last several thousand years. On the other hand, I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether you really can write with passion and fluency and everything in a language that is an L2. But then why should I be skeptical? I mean, it's really just my prejudice as a native speaker of the world's top language at the moment. So there's a lot, again, of confirmation bias and wishful thinking in all of this.
Thank you. I have one or two questions about retranslation as well. Let me put to you a question from Sandra McElvoy. Who is best placed to judge whether a work should be retranslated in the event, as she says, that the author is no longer alive? And perhaps along similar lines from Thomas West, how often are retranslations needed? What about translations prepared by someone whose understanding of the source language was poor, for example?
I'm sure there are examples where retranslations are really necessary, where new light has been shed on the source text. You know, you discover that it had been censored and that there are parts missed out, or where you realize the original edition was very poorly done and has led to misunderstandings. This would be true in the case of Bulgakov, in some cases, in some instances with Kafka and so forth. But by and large, I'm not a great supporter of retranslation. Who gets to decide whether it's necessary? Well, you know, this is the real world, only a publisher. An individual may decide he wants to retranslate, I don't know, all of Shakespeare into Russian, but without a publisher, that's not going to have much impact. So it's the commissioning publishers. On what basis do they decide? Well, I'm sure they take advice, and I'm sure they are alert to changing fashions in the target language. Books do sometimes sound a bit stuffy and old-fashioned after 50 years or 100, but that may be because they are stuffy and old-fashioned books, and the judgment as to whether the translator can do anything about it is quite a delicate one, and it's not a foregone conclusion. But I'm sorry to say that there are not many books that do ever actually get retranslated into English and published. Maybe 50, I'd be amazed if it reached 100.
Mm.
And we can probably all sit down and write the list of the top 20, those that are going to get retranslated again. Yeah, I mean, Homer and Virgil and Dante. Homer and Virgil and Dante. Homer and yeah, Madame Bovary and Kafka. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. Not, you know, by the time you get to 20, you're doing really well. And the reason, of course, is modern copyright legislation. And the reason why these people get retranslated is that they fall into the public domain 70 years after the death of the author. And publishers seek to maintain their market share by commissioning a new translation that replaces one that some other publisher has. So I'm a little bit skeptical and a little bit sad that so much of the discussion about translation has used as its material examples and is focused on this really very tiny set of books that are that have been retranslated and are amenable to being retranslated in the next decades. I think we should talk about something else.
Let's do that. I have a question for you from, it's maybe Elise Wolf or Elise Wolf, who asks, well, the question relating to your discussion of the foreign, and asks about, in a sense, I suppose, he wouldn't want to be thought of as the elephant in the room, but what do you think of today's theories, e.g. Venuti? Do you have favorite translation theories? So a question, you were talking, of course, about domestication and foreignization, but specifically then about Lawrence Venuti's theorization.
Yeah, well, I'm glad this question came up because it may make it a bit more explicit to other people. But what I said is expresses a degree of skepticism about the whole debate of difference between foreignizing and domesticating. The angle I took on it today was to ask us whether we really know what we mean by foreign. And if we don't really know what we mean by foreign, indeed we don't, then how can we know what we mean by foreignizing? So no, I'm skeptical of that dichotomy. I'm sympathetic to Lawrence Venuti's attempt to gain respect and attention for translation, and to get outside of what used to be a very conventional way of thinking about translation quality. But I do personally think that the dichotomy that he adopts from prior centuries of translation discussion is actually not really appropriate, and it's not a good enough grounding for the arguments that he pursues.
Thank you. I have a question about teaching, about translation in the academy, and specifically with in relation to the situation in the UK and the debate that has been prominent for several years now about translation as research. Following on from your thematization of expertise, a question from an anonymous questioner. Do you think that translation should be considered research in universities? In the UK, very few recognize it as such, and thus literary translators cannot apply for university positions.
That's a difficult one. I have done what I can over the past 30 years and more, but in the UK to begin with and in the US thereafter, to gain more genuine respect for the work that translators do, or rather, more modestly, for the translation work that academics do. There's a nuance there. It is easier to bludgeon committees and so forth to count the translation work done by academics as part of their academic profile than it is, of course, to persuade them that the profile of a professional translator should count as an academic one.
Yes.
I mean, I think translators have in the past been treated absolutely outrageously by academic institutions. And I think back to Giovanni Pontiero, one of the great translators of Brazilian literature, who was treated at the university where I used to work with contempt and with scorn. And that really, I think, shouldn't happen again. And I think it's not happening like that, at least in my in the places I'm aware of. At the same time, since I am a translator and an academic, there is a difference. I love translating because it's a nice balance between, for me anyway, the sort of creative side of things and the scholarly side of things. But it's demanding and is often demanding on scholarly talents, but it's not demanding in the same way that writing a scholarly article is. It may be a great deal more valuable and of much greater use. In fact, I think it is. But I do see the difficulty when trying to compare and trying to evaluate and make comparative evaluations. There is a difficulty with translation because, important and scholarly as it may be, it is not actually the same thing as academic work. And that's tricky.
Indeed. I have a number of questions have come through on the topic of machine translation for literary material. I think following on from your thematization of the mystery of the genius of the individual translator at points in your lecture, and Mehmet Shahin has asked whether you think that machine translation might ultimately replace human translators, and what your view is about the quality of machine translation and the issues that it poses for literary translators today.
I don't really have any views about the quality of machine translation, since I don't use it, and I don't really have any wide experience of how well it works. I find it extremely impressive that machine translation can work at all. A number of quite profound or long-standing intellectual and linguistic problems have been, well, they've not so much been solved as trampled underfoot by the engineers, and I guess they deserve our congratulations. I can't imagine that any machine translation algorithm will ever be specifically developed for the translation of literary work. I can't see the point, and anyway, it wouldn't be very commercial. So I don't really think that, I don't think it's likely, I don't think it's a threat that machine translation will invade the actual sphere of translating works of literature. If it does, well, it'll be very interesting, but we do have to remember that machine translation devices do not actually translate anything. That's to say, there's not even any simulation of comprehension, analysis, and so forth. So what comes out is a triumph of engineering ingenuity, but it's not actually translation. So I wouldn't lose any sleep over the future of literary translators in respect of advances in AI and MT.
That sounds a tremendously optimistic note on which to bring our discussion to a conclusion. Thank you, Professor Bellos. Thank you, David, for taking these questions after your wonderful lecture. Thank you, everybody, for putting those questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to take anything like all of your questions. But thank you once again to our colleagues at the British Library for hosting us. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We will be making a recording of this lecture and of the discussion available on the BCLT website, and I think the BCLT web address was shown earlier on. So thank you all once again, and thank you in particular to our speaker, David Bellos. Thank you.